I'm just going to, we're each going to just talk really briefly, so I'm just going to sketch out how the Transforming Community Project got started and what we're trying to do there. The Transforming Community Project started with an ad hoc group of faculty who met, who started gathering around issues of race and racism at Emory. Really, I would say, around questions of how to define racism in an institution like Emory. It came, this gathering came about after a series of very difficult events at Emory in the academic year 2003-2004, a year I sometimes refer to as the year that Emory went from 6 niggers in a woodpile to Irish anti-Semitism. And that sort of gives you the scope. So it wasn't just about black and white issues. Throughout that year, there were a range of issues, a range of players, if you will. It wasn't just, often we think of these as issues that are about student interactions, but our year started with faculty issues. There were faculty-staff interactions that didn't go well, and then ending with students protesting Mary Robinson receiving an honorary medal, the former president of Ireland who had participated in the 2001 Durban Anti-Racism Conference in South Africa. So not only about things at Emory, but also about how things at Emory reflected tensions in the wider world. The issues that came up were how do we talk to each other about race, and what are the stories and histories that we have about race at Emory. And what quickly became clear is that our understanding as a community, our understandings of the history and stories of race and racism at Emory really fractured not only along racial lines, but also very much along hierarchical lines. So staff really had a very different experience of Emory from a racial standpoint. Faculty had another, and I would say, regardless of race, I'll never forget myself as a faculty member going to a university staff council meeting and seeing a very different racial demography at that meeting. That who was working at Emory in staff positions is very different from the demography of faculty and certainly of students. Undergirding this idea that there were all these different stories and histories of race that were part of the Emory community was also the realization that there was a real lack of direct knowledge about Emory's racial history, that people really didn't know much about the history of race at Emory. And I'm going to just give you a brief few snapshots of Emory through the history of race. Emory was founded in 1836, as a colleague of mine has said, as a jewel of the cotton enslaved South. It was central to the split between the Methodist Church, North and South, and there's a really fascinating story about Emory and that history, and actually my colleague here, Mark Auslander, with a group of students, really uncovered that history even before we got started, and did some fascinating and amazing work around that history, and we may talk about that today, I'm sure he will. In the early 20th century, the strong presence of a theology school at Emory and Emory's missionary connection meant that there were the admission of Jewish students, also of Korean students, and students from Latin America. So our ideas of Emory as an historically white institution are challenged by the presence of those students, as well, of course, I would say by the presence of black workers throughout Emory's history. In the early 1960s, Emory took leadership in the state of Georgia regarding how private institutions are desegregated. They launched the lawsuit that enabled private institutions to desegregate without tax penalties. The Transforming Community Project thus takes this history and really tries to familiarize its participants with some of these central pieces of Emory's racial history, as well as get people to talk about issues that are more contemporary, issues that have happened in a more contemporary frame. We have two main prongs in the project. One, the community dialogues, in which people, small groups of faculty, staff, students, and alums can choose to meet over a meal over the course of a semester, follow a set syllabus, and use that syllabus as a jumping off point to discuss their own position at Emory. So if you know about the work of anti-racism workshops like the National Coalition Building Institute, many of those start from what is your experience, how has it made you feel. We wanted to have some of that, but also grounded in a context of what is the history of which you are a part. How does this relate to longer term trends in the university, both looking backwards but also looking forwards. So that's one experience, and that's probably the most popular aspect of our project. The second strand of the Transforming Community Project, and for us as historians, the more challenging strand, and certainly continues to be challenging for me, is the gathering the tools. With gathering the tools, it's also a semester-long workshop, and again, anyone in the Emory community can choose to join this group and learn how to do history. We teach them about the archives and what's available. We encourage them to come up with their own questions and answers about Emory's history. We also do oral history workshops, and then we encourage them to think about how they want to present the research that they've done. Both of these programs are most largely attended by staff people. So particularly with Gathering the Tools, you're talking about people who do not think of themselves as professional historians at all, who are invited to research in the archives and to interview perhaps their colleagues or perhaps people who've been there before, and to really make a statement about what Emory's racial history is. Our participants, the vast majority of our participants, as I said, have been staff, I think throughout the whole process. Our last numbers, about a year ago, we've had 1,500 people participate in the formal programs. And we've been up since 2004. Next year is our last year of funding. I'll talk about it in a second. Our idea for this, let me say, another word about who our participants have been. We've had, the majority have been staff. We've had some students, although our students, there are other tracks that they can get involved with the project that don't entail these two in particular, but we have had undergraduate and graduate student participants. We've also had 12% faculty participation, and that's the exact percentage of faculty at Emory. So when I think that it's a low number, and then I go and compare it to the demographics of Emory, I say, well, it's the exact percentage of faculty participation. The other thing I would say about our participants is that the vast majority of them are women. We are still trying to figure out why men do not get involved in the project anywhere close to their percentage in the university. The idea of both the community dialogues and the Gathering the Tools process is to use the tools of academia to address some of these entrenched racial problems, and also to share these tools with unusual suspects, I would say. We encourage people to look at the long history at Emory and to think in a, I would say, a more measured way about some of the issues that people, that we all get involved with in the institution. And we hope that, particularly with the community dialogues, that people will also have the opportunity to, in a less reactive moment, think through what are some good strategies for dealing with the institutions that we live in. I think people get to, in a sense, I wouldn't say practice, but to really think through in a safe space how they want to be part of a diverse institution, what kinds of things they might want to take back to their own work units. And they also build bonds across racial lines that are, I would say, somewhat unusual at Emory, and certainly across hierarchical lines, and that's very unusual at Emory. And it's probably more unusual at institutions than we think. I'll say one more word about the racial breakdown. It's just about even blacks and whites. There's a slightly larger number of whites who participate than blacks, and both of those numbers are in the 40%. And then we have other groups that participate, which again is reflective of the racial demographic at Emory. One word about funding, and then I'll close. We were funded, we were fortunate as we were getting off the ground that Earl Lewis became our provost, the first African-American provost at Emory, and at that time I think one of two black provosts in higher education in predominantly white institutions in the country. And I came to him with what was still a very inchoate idea that I think barely had gotten a name, the name Transforming Community Project. And he said, sounds great. And I originally, thought it would just be about faculty and would just be about Emory College, which is where I'm sitting. He said, well, why doesn't the whole university do this? And I went, okay, very naively. But I think it has been the richest. He was right to bring it out to the university. It was a much more difficult task than if we had just stayed with Emory College. But it is slowly making its inroads, for example, into the medical sciences in ways that are really interesting and fascinating. And the history there is also interesting and fascinating. And so it's taken so much more time than if we were just in one school of Emory University, but I think it's been worth the struggle. So Emory initially committed some seed money, and I think we were estimating that Emory has committed about $1.5 million over the course of the, for $1.2 million, something like that, over the course of the, we'll have over the course of the 5 years that we've been up and running, including a year prior to that. I should have, it's over 6 years. We also got off the ground as the Difficult Dialogues Initiative of the Ford Foundation was getting started, and that was initially a 2-year grant cycle, and we received $100,000 from them.